What would you say? Would you tribute your lover, your family, or would you want them banished to hell? Would you say something nonsensical, or poignant, or hilarious? And why? What would you say if you knew the words you'd be speaking would be your last?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell the stories of the condemned and the executed, and some of the methods that have been deployed to dispatch them to the afterlife. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. This one is called Infamous Last Words of the Condemned. And as the title suggests, it will focus on the final comments made by those in the moments just before their deaths. Some of these are thoughtful, some are comical, and some are downright strange. We'll begin with some comments made by one of those condemned at the Salem witch trials, which took place in late 17th century America, and we'll selectively follow the show through to current times. Most of these passages are loosely chronologically told, based on the method of execution being hanging, firing squad, gas, electrocution, and finally lethal injection. So come join us and take a listen to the last utterings of those who were dying to be heard. First up to the scaffold is a woman named Sarah Good, one of the first three accused of witchcraft at Salem. She was born Sarah Sollert in the environs of Salem in 1653, so this was just 3 decades or so after the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth in 1620. When she was 17, her father committed suicide. Now, I don't think that would have been in the Puritan playbook, but he did. And he left a considerable estate of 70 acres, but he left no will. And as was custom at the time, she received no dowry of any kind, and that was left to her 2 brothers, and she soon found herself destitute and forced to beg door to door in and around Salem. Perhaps because of this, she was largely shunned and disliked in the community, and even her husband was known to remark that, quote, she was an enemy to all good. She was also known to have never attended church, which was actually a very serious crime at this time and in this place. She, along with Tituba and Sarah Osborne, were singled out by 2 local girls, Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris, as having bewitched them, which caused all sorts of tremors, convulsions, and other inexplicable physical ailments. She was tried for witchcraft and sentenced to hang, but unlike the others that received the same fate, she was defiant as to her innocence. And after being led to the scaffold, she directed her last words to the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who had demanded she confess to Almighty God. And she says, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Wow. She hanged July 19th, 1692, aged 39. Damn, I love that fire and brimstone speak of those early American Puritans. It's great stuff. And just go to any of those old Massachusetts graveyards and read the inscriptions on the tombstones, and you'll see what I mean. Next up are some very famous last words that you've no doubt heard before, short, succinct, and powerful. And they come from the lips of the Revolutionary War hero Nathan Hale at his hanging as a spy in 1776. And they are,
I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country.
Now, there remains some skepticism as to whether he said this or not, as the words seem perhaps overly romanticized to cynical generations that have followed. And it's also been questioned as these words are uncannily similar to those of a drama popular in the day called Cato by Joseph Addison. A portion of it reads, "What a pity it is that we can die but once to serve our country." And a lot of historians have speculated that this was at least drawn from the play, and it's known that George Washington actually read excerpts to his troops. So maybe there's some truth in that. But for what it's worth, research tells me that these words actually were spoken by Hale from the gallows, but you can decide for yourself. Now here's a man named Jeroboam, I hope I have that right, we'll call him Jerry, Beauchamp, a convicted murderer who was hanged in Kentucky in 1826. He had killed a state representative named Solomon Sharp after the politician had denied a paternity suit filed by J.B., claiming that a newborn baby born to his new bride, Anna Cook, was his. Sharp alleged the boy was a mulatto and therefore the Caucasian Beauchamp could not be the father. He instead claimed the boy was fathered by one of the Cook family slaves. JB was not happy to hear that. From his jail cell, he wrote to his newlywed the following:
"Your husband is dying happy. For you I lived, and for you I die. I hope you may yet be recovered. If you are, live till it is God's will to take you, and prepare to meet me in a better world. Your dying husband, J.O. Beauchamp."
Well, this couple was really smitten with each other, as Anna was allowed, at her request, to stay with her husband in the days leading up to his execution. And during this brief period, both tried to commit suicide twice, but failed both times. And on the way to his moment of reckoning, both stabbed themselves, and he was hurried to the gallows before he could bleed to death, and he was hanged. She, on the other hand, died of her wounds from her own hand before medical attention could be found. This Gothic tale inspired Edgar Allan Poe's unfinished work, Politian, I hope I have that right, as well as Robert Panwarin's story, World Enough and Time. We'll mention the notorious abolitionist John Brown next, but only briefly, as we'll be covering him and the fate of his conspirators at Harper's Ferry in an upcoming episode. So be on the lookout for that one. Brown was famously hanged at Harper's Ferry, then Virginia, now West Virginia, in December of 1859, and his execution was one of the last straws leading to the American Civil War. If you're at all familiar with Brown, it won't surprise you that his last words were short and direct. He was not a man akin to flowery or sentimental language. And he said simply,
"I am ready at any time, but do not keep me needlessly waiting."
Enough said. Lots more about him on that next show. Moving on now to Joseph Windrath, who was executed for robbery and murder in Illinois in 1896. This is a weird one. He spent the last few weeks of his life muttering nonsense to himself in his cell, repeatedly saying, quote,
Put him in the bad box. Put him in the bad box. Put him in the bad box.
And he said this over and over and over.
Put him in the bad box.
When his wife came to visit him in jail, she asked him if he recognized her. And he again repeated this odd sentence.
Put him in the bad box.
He was examined on at least a few occasions during this period, and he was declared sane enough to hang. So on June 5th, he was led to the gallows, and you want to guess what he said? Well, you got it, but there's a little catch here. He said,
Put him in the bad box. Put him in the...
And then the trap was released. It seems his jailers and the executioner were so tired of hearing this that they literally cut him off in mid-sentence and sent him to eternity.
Put him in the bad box.
So what did this odd muttering mean? Well, a newspaper account of the day suggests that he was probably speaking of his accomplice in the crime that had implicated him. Something similar happened to that of Paul Rowland, another murderer, this time hanged in California in 1929. He was originally a bank robber, but after being in prison for that, he seemed to have taken a particular fancy to another inmate named Alger Morrison. Morrison wasn't interested, so Rowland ended up stabbing him to death with a shank. Though he probably intended otherwise, his final statement from the gallows was very short. He began,
"I have something of interest to tell."
And then bam, the trap fell again. And that's a shame, actually, because it would have been very interesting to know what his story of interest was. Well, the next guy is Wesley DOD, who some of you may have heard of. He was a pedophile and a serial killer who admitted to the murders of at least 4 young boys in Washington State in the 1980s and early 90s. He made international news for freely confessing to his crimes and refusing all appeals to spare his own tragic life. In court, he told the judge, quote, "I
must be executed before I have an opportunity to escape or kill somebody else. If I do escape, I promise you I will kill and rape again, and I will enjoy every minute of it." He
was also unusual in the sense that he chose hanging to lethal injection, with the reasoning for this being that he hanged his youngest victim in a closet and he felt he should make his exit in the same manner. His final last words were as follows.
I was asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way sex offenders could be stopped. I said no. I was wrong. I said there was no hope, no peace. But there is peace. There is hope. I found both in the Lord Jesus Christ.
We'd be remiss not to mention Private Eddie Slovic, the only U.S. soldier executed by his own country during World War II. His comments were, "Don't worry about me. I'm okay. They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. Thousands of guys have done that. They're shooting me for the bread I stole when I was 12 years old." Another killed by firing squad was James Rogers, convicted of murder and shot in Utah in 1960. As was long the case in that state, the prisoner was allowed to choose between hanging or firing squad, and he was the 37th man to choose the latter. When asked if he had any last requests, his reply was a great one, I think. He said,
Why, yes, a bulletproof vest.
all right, some sense of humor, when it's hard to find a sense of humor, I assume. Giuseppe Zangaro was an Italian immigrant anarchist who attempted to assassinate Franklin Roosevelt in Miami in 1933. He failed at this, but he did manage to kill Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak. Cermak was out campaigning with the president, and he also wounded a number of other bystanders. He made no attempt at all to flee, and he remarked from his prison cell, the Dade County Courthouse, he said, "I kill kings and presidents first, and then all capitalists." Whew, that's a pretty big hit list. He ended up sitting on the old Sparky at the Florida State Prison in Rayford and remained defiant to the end. His semi-literate last words were, "I no want minister. There's no God. It's all below. I go myself. I no scared of electric chair. No cameraman? No movie to take a picture of Zangara? Lousy capitalist. No picture, capitalist? No one here to take picture? All capitalists lousy bunch of crooks. Goodbye. Adios to all the world. Push the button." You go, Giuseppe, you go. The next guy was gassed to death in 1943 at San Quentin, and his name was Warren Kramer. He was considered to be a, quote, brilliant man by the warden of the time, Clinton Duffy, who said that, quote,
He had a rotten streak in his system which he could not control. Like many others here, he sought to be executed rather than languish in prison.
As the gas filled the chamber, he sniffed and he said,
I can't smell anything yet.
followed very soon after with,
Yuck! Smells like rotten eggs.
not the most eloquent final statement for a brilliant man, but nevertheless. Moving on to Robert Battelino, a murderer gassed in Colorado in January of 1949. A priest was summoned to issue last rites, and he responded by spitting in his face. And then before the gas was released, he shouted, I hate your guts, and I look forward to seeing my friends in hell. Very nice guy. Next is Robert Alton Harris, who again is a name that some in the audience may recognize. He was the first person executed in California following the resumption of the death penalty nationwide in 1976. After spending about 15 years on death row for 2 murders perpetrated along with his brother, he was led to the gas chamber at San Quentin in 1992. He was obviously a real intellectual as he purloined his final words from that cinematic masterpiece, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And it goes like this.
You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper.
Now that is downright Shakespearean, if you ask me. Arthur Gary Bishop was a former Eagle Scout, honor student, and Mormon missionary. That is before he decided to molest and murder 5 young boys in a 5-year span. And he's another one that dismissed his lawyers and waived his appeals in order to expedite his execution. He said, quote,
I did pretty good till about 5 minutes ago. Now my nerves are gone.
He wept uncontrollably until he was executed in Utah on June 10th, 1988. Now here's one you've definitely heard about, and that's the notorious killer clown, John Wayne Gacy. No point to go into his story here, as it's so well known and chronicled. But much lesser known were his last words before the needle found his vein. And there's only 3 of them, and they are,
"Kiss my ass."
you ever seen him? That is one ass I would never want to kiss. Thomas Grasso, executed in Oklahoma in 1995, was not only a murderer, it turns out he was a very, very picky eater, and he was adamant that the world know about this. He said, "Please tell the media I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Next up is William Prince Davis, robbery and murder, executed in Texas in 1999. He was 42 at the time of his death, and he spent more than half of those years incarcerated. He said that the only thing he found pleasure in while in prison was watching sports on the communal TV. So I guess it's only fitting that when strapped into the gurney, he reportedly said with a smile, "How about them Cowboys?" Here comes another movie buff, and it's another name that you'll probably recognize, and that's Aileen Wuornos. She was a prostitute and a murderer and was famously portrayed by Charlize Theron in the film Monster, as well as the subject of many documentaries, most notably 2 by the filmmaker Nick Broomfield. On the day of her execution, she told Broomfield that the police framed her and used sonic waves to control her. This may or may not have been a ruse to delay or stay her execution, but she was already deemed to be fit for injection, so things proceeded accordingly. And her comments are really weird. She says,
"I'd just like to say I'll be sailing with The Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back."
I don't think anybody's seen her. I don't think she's been back. And here comes Douglas Roberts, kidnapping, robbery, and murder, and executed in Texas in 2005. And his last testament was,
"I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I leave, I want to tell you all, when I die, bury me deep. Lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm dead. I'll see you in heaven someday. That's all, Warden."
Lamont Reese, again in Texas. Seems like almost all of it's in Texas at this point. This time it's 2006 for a triple murder. His last words were not prepared, but just a simple comment made after being injected with the lethal dose. He remarked to the attendant,
"Ooh, this is some kind of nasty."
Well, the scene here is even more tragic than most, though, as his mother, Brenda, became uncontrollable and charged the window of the death chamber, wailing and pounding on it repeatedly, shrieking,
"They killed my baby,"
before finally being restrained. But not before she kicked 2 holes in the chamber wall, and then she eventually collapsed after being removed. We'll wrap things up with the eloquence of Richard 𝐊𝐒, who had killed 2 college students in 1986 and was finally executed in Ohio in 2008. When asked if he'd like to make a final statement, he replied,
"For what? You motherfuckers haven't paid attention to anything I've said for 22 years. Why would anyone pay any attention to anything I have to say now?"
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.